I think it's safe to assume that anybody who has watched a movie or two over the years can remember that iconic blue and yellow Touchstone Pictures logo. The studio is now defunct, but the legacy of movies left behind from this label, I think, will stand the test of time. Created by Disney, Touchstone Pictures would kick off its run of production in the mid-80s, and it would pump out quality movies until they ceased operations in 2016. In this video, I'll be breaking down the Touchstone filmography from its splashy beginnings in 1984 through 1986, so let's take a ride back in cinematic time. What's up out there, guys? It's awesome to have you back. If you're new here, welcome to Movies Never Say Die. I'm Anthony DeJoya, and this is your home for 80s and 90s retro content, and Touchstone Pictures is certainly cemented in the legacy of retro cinema history. It had a few variations over the years, but when that familiar logo would scroll across the bottom of the screen, you more than likely knew you were in for an entertaining movie. But before we start diving into the studio's extensive filmography, let's quickly talk about the origins of Touchstone Pictures. Now, we all know the Disney label has always been known for kids' content, and they made a pretty penny from that during the late 70s. However, that kid-friendly reputation of Disney was beginning to hurt the company at the box office in the genre that once brought them money. Kids' content was now sort of boxing them in financially. Disney began tinkering with films that would hope to aim to an older audience, beginning with films like Escape to Witch Mountain in 75, as well as its sequel in 78, but these were still G-rated films though, and they didn't bring in the returns the studio had hoped. So closing out the 70s and heading into the early 80s, Disney would continue to work on more PG-rated films under distribution deals with both Paramount Pictures and Buena Vista Distribution. This was a way for Disney to profit on adult content while still maintaining their sugary clean image for kids and parents. From the late 70s until around early 83, films like Night Crossing and Tron and Trenchcoat, Midnight Madness and The Devil and Max Devlin and others would be released, but none would move the financial needle. Disney would also co-produce Dragon Slayer and Popeye with Paramount Pictures, but neither of those films took off at the time. So between 1982 and 1983, Disney would lose in excess of $60 million from their ventures into edgier PG-rated films, which to me is where the problem existed for Disney in the first place. The fact that they considered edgier content simply meaning soft PG-rated films. And the public wasn't fooled. They never really felt this was edgy content or adult-themed content, and everybody knew Disney was still known for younger-themed movies. Just because they were coming out with these PG-rated films didn't necessarily mean they were coming out with adult-themed content, and Disney had been trying to play both sides, and it cost them a small fortune. So it was then decided they needed a new, completely different distribution brand to produce films for the grown folk. First announced in late 82, Disney VP of Productions Tom Wilhite said the studio planned to release more mature films under a completely new banner. Wilhite explained, saying this would allow them a wider latitude with mature content and different subject matter. They would still refrain from raunchy and graphic content, but the possibility of R-rated releases was never taken off the table. After a little more than a year of development, in February of '84, then Disney CEO Ron Miller founded Touchstone Films. Now, Touchstone Films was simply a pseudonym. It was not a distinct business operation. The Touchstone Films name was just a banner. These movies would be produced on Disney's dime, and they planned to release around 4 movies or so a year for adult audiences under the Touchstone Films name. And with the Disney connection, the ability to amass stars to their projects came relatively easy, and they would really shoot out of the gate hot with their first movie.
I've been waiting for someone, and when I find her, she's a fish.
The romantic comedy Splash would be directed by Ron Howard. Tom Hanks and Daryl Hannah were in the leads. John Candy and Eugene Levy were in supporting roles, so it had all the right pieces for success. Now, to be honest, this was never really to my taste. I think it's an okay movie, but I'm certainly not as high on it as the majority. However, this tale of a dude falling in love with a mermaid captured the hearts of moviegoers. It was well received by critics. It killed it at the box office throughout the spring and into the summer, making Touchstone Films a seeming instant success. Splash would drop into theaters on March 9th, 1984 and take the #1 spot with a $6.1 million weekend on only 829 screens. This movie had an impressive 7,400 per theater average, which meant the theaters were full to the max for every showing, everywhere, all day. Splash would spend 8 weeks in the top 5 and would end its theatrical run with $69.8 million on a measly $11 million budget, and this charming little story of love between Hanks and Hannah would end up being the 10th highest grossing film of the year, and it would earn an Oscar nomination for Best Original Screenplay.
Mister, you can take our equipment and you can haul off all our stock, but when you come out to pull us off this land, you better come with more than a piece of paper.
From a widely accessible commercial hit, Touchstone Films would venture to the opposite side of the spectrum with a much smaller and more serious film called Country. This was a drama co-produced by Far West Productions and the Pangea Corporation. Country is a movie I haven't actually seen, but it was clearly Touchstone Films' attempt at dabbling with an awards film given the serious topic and the September 28th release date, which usually that time of year signifies the beginning of awards season for filmmaking. Jessica Lange starred in this movie alongside her real-life man at the time, Sam Shepard, as a rural couple fighting to keep a hold of their farm during these shifts in economic times. This was something really being experienced by American farmers in the 80s, and even President at the time, Ronald Reagan, stated that this film was blatant propaganda against government agricultural programs. Jessica Lange was actually so involved in this project that she was brought before a U.S. congressional panel to testify as an expert about living and working on family farms. Not overly intrigued, however, were the audiences. Country would get a staggered release, opening in a few major markets before getting a slow rollout, and it never really caught on with moviegoers, pulling in only $9.6 million on a $10 million budget, but Jessica Lange would get an Oscar nomination for Best Actress. However, outside of that and a few other nominations from various smaller guilds and critic circles during award season, this Jessica Lange passion project Touchstone Films had acquired from the Ladd Company did little to move the needle, quickly bringing executives back down to earth after riding the high of Splash's financial and critical success.
It's a hatchling. Look at you.
Then would come 1985, and with the new year, Touchstone Films would take things back to basics. Baby's Secret of the Lost Legend would be released in late March of 1985. The story centered on a couple who discover a mother and baby brontosaurus in Africa, and of course will have to fight to protect them from violent poachers, and this heartwarming dino adventure was sadly not the crowd pleaser Touchstone Films had hoped to kick the year off with. Baby Secret of the Lost Legend would open with a $4 million weekend, but it was also competing against The Last Dragon, Porky's Revenge, and Friday the 13th, A New Beginning, all of which opened on the weekend of the 22nd. So competition was tough, and this movie would only manage to take the #5 spot at the box office, and just after 3 weeks, it was already out of the theater with a meager $14.9 million on a $13 million budget. Now, I do think this is a decent film. I enjoyed it as a kid and I watched it a ton, but what does that tell you? Touchstone was regressing back to kids' movies with adult themes, and it had failed them once again. This movie would get recut and get a new name, Dinosaur Secret of the Lost Legend, which would play on NBC's The Magical World of Disney, so I assume that's where I watched it the most when I was a kid. And this was another of those movies that just seemed to be on cable every weekend around lunchtime during the mid-80s. It's your typical emotionally driven adventure for kids. The cast is solid and the scoring from Jerry Goldsmith is perfectly calibrated to the dramatic undercurrent of the plot. The effects are naturally dated and it's a little dark in places like many kid-themed movies were during the era, and today it certainly has this nostalgia factor, but for Touchstone Films at the time, it was a financial disappointment.
I mean, this is generating power and light without heat, Michael.
How is that possible?
It's not possible.
Something that was oddly trendy with moviegoers in 1985 was the teen science fiction adventure flick. Movies like Real Genius and Weird Science and Back to the Future were white-hot studio properties, so of course Touchstone Films wanted to get into the mix with My Science Project, a comedy adventure about a teenager who steals a piece of government equipment to use for his science project, only to realize he has something much more life-changing in his possession. Personally, I've always enjoyed this movie. I don't like it as much as the other films I just mentioned, but I do have fun with it. I think it's a charming adventure film filled with a lot of action and just 80s teen humor. The dated effects are nostalgic. That's when this movie is its most fun, but really the problem with this one is it just came out at the wrong time. My Science Project would land in the 14th spot with just $1.5 million its opening weekend. It would just have a 2-week run before getting pulled, bringing in just $4.1 million on an $8 million budget. Released on August 9th, this movie really did face some serious competition, though. It had Summer Rental, Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and coincidentally Real Genius to deal with its opening weekend. Then there was other recently released films like Back to the Future, Weird Science, Fright Night, and National Lampoon's European Vacation to contend with. So despite the traffic, this was another miss for Touchstone Films. As we already know, Touchstone was a division of Disney, and there was a lot of corporate movement in the early 80s. Walt Disney had passed in 66, Roy Disney had passed in 71, and with Ron Miller in charge, the company had lost millions of dollars and barely survived a series of takeover attempts. Stockholders were naturally displeased with where the company was going, so it was announced that a change would be made. Miller was given the boot, and Paramount CEO Michael Eisner was brought in to take the new CEO position in 1984. He believed in taking chances to achieve success. He built a team around himself to turn Disney and subsequently Touchstone Films around, because it was clear that the Touchstone venture was pretty much sputtering out of the gate so far outside of Splash's success. Now, Eisner's first year in charge was a little rough at the cinema. 1985 was another crappy year business-wise, but to his credit, he had just gotten there, and all of these projects had been in motion prior to his hiring, but there were some movements behind the scenes, though. Disney would form a partnership with E.F. Hutton, an investment firm, and Silver Screen Partners 2 would be formed as a medium to raise over $150 million for future films. This money would be split between Disney and Touchstone projects, with Eisner projecting around 4 movies per year from Disney and around 8 to 10 movies per year from the Touchstone label. So naturally, with that many projects, the budgets would need to be manageable, which is something that we'll get into a little bit deeper here in a second.
Barbara, is that the new pool man? Hey! Call 911!
1986 would begin, and Eisner and his team were already at work with the first film to be released under their regime and the first R-rated movie to come from under the Disney umbrella, Down and Out in Beverly Hills, starring Nick Nolte, Bette Midler, and Richard Dreyfuss. This movie centered on a highly dysfunctional rich couple that saves a homeless man who tries to drown himself in their pool. This movie is just wildly humorous. The premise is simple. It's unique. The performances go all in on these eccentric characters, and I remember watching this movie so many times as a kid on cable. I think the writing is so sharp-witted and clever here, and with the team of Dreyfuss, Midler, and Nolte, there is no shortage of charisma and personality. This is a movie that's absurd in all the silly ways you would hope from a parody on socialite life, and audiences dug it. Down and Out in Beverly Hills would hit theaters on January 31st, taking the #1 spot with a $5.7 million opening weekend, dethroning The Color Purple from the top position and beating out other movies opening that weekend, such as Youngblood and The Best of Times. Down and Out would spend 4 weeks in the #1 spot, 7 weeks in the top 5, and it would end its box office run with $62.1 million on just a $14 million budget. So with this first film under Eisner leadership, Touchstone Pictures was sitting on another box office hit, and to me, this is when the Touchstone brand would really begin to take off. 1986 would be a big year for Touchstone Films. They would release 4 more movies. As I said, Down and Out was made for just $14 million, and it was because Eisner had a methodology to keeping his budgets down. He would target stars either fading from popularity, just on the rise, or those dealing with legal issues that would work for cheap. Also in 1986, he signed a 5-year deal with Showtime for exclusive airing rights, a deal reportedly worth well up into the 9 figures for all of Touchstone's movies to be aired on Showtime and the Movie Channel. So things were starting to change for the label as they finally stepped into what the majority of the world considered teen and adult targeted movies, something it appeared Eisner actually knew the definition of. It wasn't the 50s anymore, it was the 80s. People were spending money, having recreational sex, blowing through coke, partying, moving out to the suburbs and starting families, and they wanted to see movies that represented those things.
Patrolman Abraham Washington from the 22nd Precinct.
Not the 22nd. We never say the 22nd, it's the 2-2.
Just a few months after the release of Down and Out, Touchstone would release their next movie, a small comedy called Offbeat, starring Judge Reinhold, Meg Tilly, John Turturro, John Montana, and Harvey Keitel. The fun plot in this one revolves around a young man who poses as a cop for his buddy who was selected to do a dance performance and, of course, ends up falling in love and getting roped up in a bunch of silly comical hijinks. Now, I'll be honest, I completely forgot about this movie until making this video. I had to go back and rewatch it again. I remember watching it on cable so many times when I was a kid. I was always a big fan of Judge Reinhold and felt like this movie just was always playing during the weekends on the late mornings. Offbeat would open on April 11th. It would take the number 5 spot with a decent $2 million weekend right in between Band in the Hand and Critters that also opened. It would only pull in $4.1 million on a $10 million budget though, so it certainly wasn't a movie that banked for Touchstone, but as I said, I watched it on cable countless times now, to which I can assume was either Showtime and the Movie Channel. It was relatively well received from critics, but just never really took off.
Don't you consider throwing a body off a cliff in the dead of night violent?
Nah, she'll be unconscious.
Just 2 months later, Touchstone Films would release its next movie, and instantly the studio would have another bona fide hit on their hands with Ruthless People, starring Danny DeVito, Bette Midler, Helen Slater, Judge Reinhold, and Bill Pullman in his first feature film. This wildly fun comedy is centered on a clothing manufacturer who originally plans to kill his wife to inherit a fortune, but discovers that she's already been kidnapped by a couple that he stole a garment design from when he goes to attempt his plan. Ruthless People would drop into theaters in the middle of the summer on June 27th of 86, and it would take the number 4 spot with a $5.2 million weekend. Not a bad spot, I think, given the competition that it had for movies like The Karate Kid 2, Back to School, and the biggest summer movie that year, Top Gun, which was just vacuuming up a bulk of the summer box office profitability. Ruthless People, however, though, was a textbook example of why sometimes it's just as beneficial to have legs at the theater rather than having that quick burst for a few weeks only to flatline after. Ruthless People would spend 5 weeks in the box office top 5. It would spend a total of 15 weeks in the top 10, and it would close out its theatrical run with $71.6 million on just a $13 million budget. Michael Eisner's hire cheap philosophy was working. Midler was signed to a multi-picture arrangement deal after the success of Down and Out, and the studio passed on Jack Nicholson for the lead role in this one due to his $4 million salary demand, which turned out to be a great decision. They saved some money, and DeVito and Midler were such a charming duo for this simple premise. They made this movie, and they also helped make what would end up being a comedic gem that would also end up being the 9th highest grossing movie on the worldwide box office list in 1986. With Ruthless People still charming audiences on the big screen, Touchstone's next movie would be released on the first weekend of October. However, there would be a slight change this time around. Ruthless People would actually be the last movie to be released under the Touchstone Films name. Earlier, Eisner and his team had lobbied for a name change. They'd done so for several months. Their initial recommendation was to change the name to Hollywood Pictures. This is actually a studio label that would come to fruition later in 1989, but at the time it was not voted in. I assume that they didn't want such a drastic name change after only a few years into existence, so it was decided that all future movies would be released as Touchstone Pictures.
I never met so many stupid people in one day. Ugly, too.
The crime comedy Tough Guys would feature a couple of Hollywood legends when Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas would team up to play a couple of old gangsters who are released from a 30-year prison stint, only to find the world is completely changed, except for the ability to get in trouble, which remains just the same. Now, I remember bits and pieces of this movie from seeing it playing on TV here and there over the years. I had never actually watched it from start to finish until I made this video, and when I did so, I had a blast. I loved the skillful delivery of the humor, the adventurous plot is fun, and the charm of Lancaster and Douglas as a couple of golden era tough guys dropped into a modern world is just great comedy. Tough Guys would drop into theaters on October 3rd of '86 to take the #2 spot with a $4.6 million weekend, but nothing was beating Crocodile Dundee on its second weekend into #1 place, where it would spend another 7 weeks. As for Tough Guys, it was able to find its audience. This was the 7th movie Lancaster and Douglas had done together. They had been making movies together since the late 40s. They were known as being somewhat of a team during their era, so there's no doubt their final pairing here in Tough Guys was able to give this movie a built-in section of the audience. It would spend 5 weeks in the top 5 and go on to earn a respectable $21.5 million on a $10 million budget, giving Touchstone Pictures another film in the green under their belt. So as you can see, Touchstone Pictures was having a great year with 2 sizable box office hits. There were only a few months left in 1986, but Touchstone Pictures would have one last movie to close out their year. There had been a little sequel being shopped around in Hollywood at the time, but it wasn't getting any bites. Columbia Pictures passed on it, as did 20th Century Fox. Touchstone Pictures liked the project. They would greenlight its production, and when they did so, Touchstone Pictures would officially have their first awards film.
It's got a sledgehammer, right? 25 years ago, I had the screws put on me. I mean, it was over for me before it really got started.
Martin Scorsese's sequel to The Hustler, The Color of Money, starring Paul Newman, Tom Cruise, and Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio, would be the next release to come out from Touchstone Pictures. Newman would reprise his role as Fast Eddie Felson, who takes this new young pool prodigy under his wing to make some money hustling and winning tournaments, and the result to me is just a timeless classic. I absolutely love this movie. I think it's just soaked with atmosphere and great performances and pristine direction. It just made pool cool, with billiard rooms across the country suddenly filling up after this movie's release. The Color of Money would drop into theaters on October 17th to take the #2 spot with a solid $6.4 million weekend, with that damn Crocodile Dundee still in the #1 spot in its 4th week. The Color of Money would spend 7 weeks in the top 5. It would finish its theatrical run with $52.3 million on just a $14.5 million budget. The critics were high on this movie. Audiences enjoyed it as well. The Color of Money would get 4 Oscar nominations, and Paul Newman would get his first Academy Award for Best Actor. This would wrap up the year for Touchstone Pictures, and you would have to say the impression of Michael Eisner on the Touchstone side of his Disney CEO position was a success. Disney had officially been able to create films that were able to connect with teen and adult audiences. Touchstone also had its deal with Showtime, and funding their films was solidified with Silver Screen Partners too, so all was looking bright. However, just because Touchstone had released all their movies for the year didn't mean there was one last business deal to get done before 1986. Silver Screen Partners, which had raised $200 million for the 85 and 86 film slates, would enter into one of the largest film underwriting ventures in history when they would attempt to raise $300 million for a proposed 18 movies split between Disney and Touchstone. And they would get it. Touchstone would officially kick off its original production schedule. 87 would see 9 movies. 88 would deliver 10 movies, with 8 more in 89. And many of these are timeless classics from the 80s that will never go out of style. Hey, what's up out there, guys? I hope you're all having a fantastic day in your worlds. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, welcome to Movies Never Say Die. I'm Anthony DeGioia, and this is your one-stop shop for retro movie content. And today, we're moving along with this studio series covering Touchstone Pictures. If you missed it, I did do a full video covering Touchstone's beginnings and their early operations from 84 to 86. I think it came out to be a solid little video loaded with a lot of information in a short time, so definitely check that thing out if you're interested. Regardless, here's a quick breakdown of Touchstone Pictures up to 1987 to bring everybody up to speed. It all started when Disney wanted to make movies for adults, but knew the Disney name was long since tainted as being for kids, so they created the banner of Touchstone Films to separate themselves from the product. Things were naturally a bit rocky out of the gate with a couple of hits, but mostly misses, and Disney's stock continued to flounder. In 1984, Michael Eisner would come in as the new CEO of Disney, and after getting settled in for a few months, Eisner and his team would shift their focus over to Touchstone Films. 1985 was, of course, already locked in with projects from prior management, and it was not a stellar year at the box office, but Eisner and company were working behind the scenes, and they would come out of the gate hot in 1986, a year where things would really turn around for the studio, including a name change to Touchstone Pictures. So at this point, here was the basic structure of it all. The Walt Disney Company had created Touchstone Films. Disney would also partner with an investment firm to create Silver Screen Partners 2. Now, the number after is essentially the limited partnership number, or the loan number, basically. Silver Screen Partners refers to limited partnerships between the studio and essentially a bunch of ultra-rich people who invest money to produce films. Now, HBO at the time, who was still working off their original Silver Screen Partners deal from '83, was expecting another collaboration with a third limited partnership deal, but sadly HBO was out, and Silver Screen Partners 3 would be another deal with Disney. This is where investors felt their money was the safest and most assured for a hefty ROI. So in January of '87, $300 million would be raised by Silver Screen Partners 3 for film financing between Disney Pictures and Touchstone Projects, which at the time was the largest venture ever for a limited partnership by E.F. Hutton, the investment firm that brokered the deal between both sides and essentially did all the paperwork for it. Touchstone Pictures would be financed by Silver Screen Partners. Their films would be distributed to theaters by Walt Disney Pictures. Then there was the home market side, which of course Disney already had set up. Now, it had had several name changes over the years, but Buena Vista Pictures was a film distribution division created within the Disney umbrella back in 1953, and that had been their primary means of home video and theatrical distribution since. Now, on the cable side, Disney also had inked a sizable 5-year deal with Showtime for exclusive streaming rights for all Touchstone Picture movies. As for the on-screen talent, Michael Eisner was known for hiring actors on the cheap, actors whose spotlight was fading or flickering, and those on the rise, or those in legal problems, or having a falling out from a media faux pas of some sort. Eisner joked once in an interview that he actually waited out behind the Betty Ford clinic to hire his talent, which is why, as we progress through the Touchstone filmography, you'll start to recognize a handful of regulars. So on the business side of things, all was in place: financing, production, home video, cable, means of acquiring stars, all set, ready to rock and roll. Now, on the cinema side, 1986 was a positive year, as Touchstone would land 3 movies in the top 20 at the global box office, with Ruthless People, Down and Out in Beverly Hills, and The Color of Money all killing it. Not to forget, The Color of Money was officially an awards film when Newman would take home Best Actor at the Academy Awards. So the Touchstone banner had built its foundations, they had built some cachet, and in 1987, Disney, through Touchstone Pictures, would begin their climb to the top of the box office charts.
Right here, right now, both of us, kind of taking turns.
Touchstone would get right to work in January when they would release the female buddy comedy adventure Outrageous Fortune in January. This movie starred Bette Midler and Shelley Long as actresses who were polar opposites, except for the fact they shared one thing in common, that being the same lover who goes missing mysteriously, which causes these two women to join up on a cross-country adventure to search for him. Bette Midler had inked a 6-film deal with Touchstone Pictures, and this was her third. Down and Out in Beverly Hills and Ruthless People in '86 were critical and financial hits, with Midler being praised for her performances. Touchstone hoped they would get the same from Outrageous Fortune, and they were not disappointed. It would open number 2 at the box office with a $6.4 million opening opening weekend, which at the time was a record for Disney. Critics, though, were mixed, but audiences loved Midler and Long together. Outrageous Fortune would spend 6 weeks in the top 5 and would tally up $53 million globally. The budget at 20 to 25 million was slightly higher due to the expensive production and the stunt sequences, but the film was a financial success and another commercial hit for Touchstone. I enjoy this movie for the comedy that it delivers and the performances from Long and Midler. I didn't watch it a ton back in the day, but when rewatching for this video, it really just, I enjoyed the charisma from the two leads and just the fun adventure that this movie delivered.
I mean, can you figure it out? A guy bangs into my car, thinks I did him in, tries to get even with me by stealing my wife. You two fall in love.
This was that guy?
Not even 2 months later in March, Touchstone would drop another movie into theaters with Barry Levinson's Tin Men, a small time period dramedy about two rival aluminum siding salesmen played by Danny DeVito and Richard Dreyfuss in 1963 Baltimore, who go to war with one another when they are involved in a minor car accident where each claims the other is responsible. DeVito had done well with Ruthless People, and Dreyfuss scored a winner with Down and Out, so Touchstone assumed putting these two talented actors together would lead to success, and while admittedly not the success of their first Touchstone outings, DeVito and Dreyfuss had a critical winner together with Tin Men. This was certainly a niche film about a couple of salesmen from the 60s battling it out. This movie would get a soft opening on March 6th, playing on just 9 screens to pull in $187,000 to take the 13th spot, but it would get a wider release the following week and pull in $4 million to climb up to the number 4 spot, and Tin Men would be a top 5 film at the box office for a solid month to pull in a respectable $25.4 million on just an $11 million budget. This movie was well received by audiences. Critics enjoyed it as well. It was just never a film that was going to strike the masses like their other outings with Touchstone Pictures. I actually watched this movie in its entirety for this video for the first time, and I think it's a very well acted and extremely well written, grounded comedy with spots of sincere drama, and I think it's a very entertaining movie that holds up great after all these years. Off screen at this time, Disney was still working on deals to spread the Touchstone movies across the globe, and in May of '87, Disney would sign an international distribution deal. Warner Brothers Inc. would actually dissolve a 16-year-long distribution deal with Columbia Pictures and take over international releasing for Disney and Touchstone, while Disney would continue to distribute on the domestic side. Around this same time, Disney CEO Michael Eisner and executive Jeffrey Katzenberg were attending the Indianapolis 500, and during the race, there was a parade of some sorts, and both men were surprised to see this little comedian playing a goofy handyman named Ernest getting a much larger reaction from the crowd than Mickey Mouse, and suddenly, Eisner and Katzenberg had an idea. They promptly scheduled a meeting with John Cherry and Coke Sam's, creators of the Ernest character, and funny man Jim Varney, who played the role, and told them they wanted to make a movie. Cherry and Sam's were naturally all in. I mean, why wouldn't they be? Disney was out of the blue offering to give you millions of dollars to make a movie. Varney, on the other hand, feared of being typecast in the character, and he was reluctant but agreed. He even went on a rather heavy bender before filming, but it was stated that he was a complete pro once the production started.
Is that your smallest needle? I did it! I just a little bird, baby.
Ernest Goes to Camp would splash into theaters on Memorial Weekend, a little story about a summer camp handyman with big dreams of being a guidance counselor who has to earn his stripes dealing with a group of delinquents while also fending off a shady corporation wanting to close the camp would take all the kids by storm that summer. This movie would be directed by Cherry and Sam's, and alongside Jim Varney would star Victoria Racimo, 80s staple Lyle Alzado, and John Vernon. I'll be honest, I was never a huge Ernest fan. I mean, I thought he was funny. I felt like I watched him a ton as a kid, but his antics were something that I could either take or leave growing up. This movie never really grabbed me either. The drastic tonal differences between the juvenile humor and the sappy, sentimental parts were just a bit too wide for me. Even as a kid, I just really never liked the group of younger characters in this movie. So, of course, it just didn't get the repeat that Ernest Saves Christmas would. Audiences, however, ate this movie up. Now, it opened the same weekend as Beverly Hills Cop 2, which raked in $33 million. So, Ernest wasn't catching Axel Foley, but he would take the number 2 spot with a solid $6.2 million opening. Ernest Goes to Camp would only have a 5-week theatrical run, but it would be long enough for the movie to pull in $23.5 million on a measly $3.5 million budget, and just like that, Touchstone Pictures would have a franchise with Ernest, who would return for 4 more theatrical releases and another 4 on the direct-to-video market. So Touchstone Pictures scored a financial hit with Ernest Goes to Camp being made on a micro budget, but Touchstone wasn't just resting on this little movie for their summer slate and would drop their next film into theaters in just 5 weeks. Now, for Touchstone's next movie, we need to step back into late 1986 and head across town over to Paramount Pictures. Writer David Simpkins had been shopping a script around town that was a cross between Ferris Bueller's Day Off and After Hours, a high-energy, trendy teen adventure comedy. At the time, Simpkins was working for New World Pictures, who were not interested. Paramount Pictures, on the other hand, was very interested. The only caveat was they insisted that Molly Ringwald be the star. In the minds of Paramount execs, Ringwald was their Matthew Broderick for this role, but Ringwald didn't want to do the movie. Disney and Touchstone, however, were sitting on their massive Silver Screen Partners 3 fund, so they said, come on over and make your movie.
Now, boys, I swear, if you give me any grief over the next 60 minutes, I swear to God, I'll kill you. Dead. Murdered. Stabbed.
Adventures in Babysitting would center on, of course, a babysitter who brings the kids that she's looking after into the big city to help a friend out, and of course, one comical mishap after the other will occur, resulting in a night none of them would ever forget. This would be the directorial debut of Chris Columbus, and it would also be the breakout performance for Elizabeth Shue, with Maya Bruton, Keith Coogan, Anthony Rapp, and Penelope Ann Miller supporting them to round out a great cast. Adventures in Babysitting would be the first PG-13 film released by Touchstone Pictures, and while it has gone on to be a bit of an 80s classic today, it wasn't the critical success nor the financial hit the studio was hoping for. Critics were lukewarm on it, with reviews saying there wasn't much below the surface of all the teen antics, and it would open on July 3rd just to take the number 9 spot with a $2.9 million weekend. Audiences, though, loved it. Word of mouth spread, and Adventures in Babysitting would actually see a 45% bump the following weekend to take $4.2 million home, and then when all was said and done, this movie would pull in a respectable $34.4 million on just a $7 million budget. So while not being the $50 to $60 million hit Touchstone may have hoped for, it was a financial success, and I have no doubt that this movie killed it on home video because that's where I watched it a dozen or so times. I've always loved this movie. I've watched it countless times over the years. I think the comedy works. I think the characters work. The story keeps a swift pace, and it does all the genre tropes well. Now, just a month later, with Adventures in Babysitting still holding into the charts at the box office, Touchstone would drop another summer movie, one that would ultimately replicate the massive success of their prior summer with Ruthless People.
Long brown hair, brown eyes. 313 pounds. 313 pounds? Let me see that. I would imagine that's fully clothed.
Stakeout is a crime comedy directed by John Badham, centered on a couple of detectives who are assigned to watch an escaped convict's ex-girlfriend, but the case, of course, gets complicated when one of the detectives falls for her. Richard Dreyfuss was back again with Touchstone, and he would be paired this time with Emilio Estevez and Madeline Stowe in her first mainstream performance. Stakeout would drop into theaters on August 5th to take the number 2 spot with a strong $5.1 million weekend, but this movie is a classic example of the power that longevity can have for a well-received movie. Stakeout was critically liked and audiences loved it as well. With strong word of mouth spreading, it would climb to the number 1 spot its second weekend with a $5.6 million take-home, and this was the era when character-driven comedies could command the summer. Stakeout would spend 5 straight weeks in the number 1 spot at the box office. This movie would be a top 10 movie for 11 straight weeks, and when all was said and done, Stakeout earned $65.7 million on just a $14.5 million budget, and I love this movie. I've watched it so many times over the years. Dreyfuss and Estevez's odd couple pairing is a blast, and the story is able to keep a quick pace. When Stakeout is being funny, it's hilarious. When the action ramp up, so does the intensity. And overall, I consider this to be one of the all-time great action comedies out there. Just 1 week after the release of Stakeout, Touchstone Pictures would drop their last movie of the summer into theaters. It was a teen romance comedy about a shy nerd who pays the it girl $1,000 to pretend to be his girlfriend for a month so that he can gain some popularity in Can't Buy Me Love, directed by Steve Rash. With Stakeout still sitting at the top of the box office charts, Can't Buy Me Love would land in the theaters on August 14th to take the number 3 spot with a $4.8 million weekend on over 1,200 screens. Critics again were lukewarm on this movie, claiming that it wasted a chance at being a unique, sincere teen rom-com of its own to follow some of the popular tropes in the genre, but audiences again proved their disconnect from the critics and actually loved it. This movie would spend 6 of its first 7 weeks in the top 10. It would pull in $31.6 million on just an estimated $6.5 to $8 million budget. So despite the critical warnings, the general public ate this movie up, and it has gone on to be regarded as one of the classic teen rom-coms to come out of the 80s.
Let's go say hello.
You can't say hello. He was at your funeral.
From here, Touchstone would take a few months off before dropping their next release, a small little comedy called Hello Again, directed by Frank Perry, about a suburban housewife played by Shelley Long, who was brought back to life by her sister using a magical spell after she chokes to death. This movie would also star Corbin Burnson and Celia Ward. Hello Again would open on November 6th and land in the number 2 spot behind Fatal Attraction with a solid $5.7 million weekend. It would receive mixed reviews, but it ended up being a modest hit, showing the commercial appeal of Shelley Long. This movie would spend 3 weeks in the top 10. It would pull in a respectable $20.4 million on just a $10 million budget. I had only seen bits and pieces of this movie over the years, so I watched it for this video, and it certainly does have its spots of charm. I like Long's performance, but it's a bit too silly for its own good. It sort of feels like it's just kind of running through the comedic material. It doesn't really feel like it has much heart to it. However, it did have me chuckling on more than a few occasions, and it's certainly a throwback to the era of absurd yet simple plots that could mildly entertain you for 90 minutes. Now at this point in 1987, Touchstone Pictures had already released 7 movies, all to varying levels of financial success, but their last 2 movies of the year would be game changers and pull Touchstone Pictures into the big leagues. These 2 movies alone would just earn almost as much as all of their films the past 2 years combined. These 2 movies would be commercial and critical smash hits and would ride through the Christmas corridor, just vacuuming up ticket sales left and right. Several months earlier, a script was being shopped around Hollywood, as they always are. It was initially pitched to TriStar Pictures, but they passed on it. It was then put on the desk of executive Sid Sheinberg over at Universal Pictures, and he passed on it as well, feeling it was too soft for them. Disney, though, was interested. They loved soft films and felt it would be perfect for their Touchstone Pictures banner, and they sent it into production right away.
I build 50-story skyscrapers. I assemble cities of the future. I can certainly put together a diaper.
3 Men and a Baby would star 3 80s icons, Tom Selleck, Steve Guttenberg, and Ted Danson, as free-spirited bachelors who find a baby on their doorstep and through many comedic hurdles all become fathers in their own way. And surprisingly enough, this heartfelt comedy was directed by Spock himself, Leonard Nimoy. 3 Men and a Baby would open opposite Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, and it would command the number 1 spot with a solid $10.4 million weekend. Critics were positive on this movie. Audiences loved this movie's heartfelt charm and humor. 3 Men and a Baby would spend a staggering 15 weeks in the box office top 5 and another 5 months in theaters, pulling in a hefty $168 million in the States and another $72 million internationally for a massive haul of $240 million on just an $11 million budget. 3 Men and a Baby would be Disney and Touchstone Pictures' first $100 million live action movie, and it would wind up being the highest earning movie at the domestic box office in 1987, surpassing both Fatal Attraction and Beverly Hills Cop. This movie just had all the pieces. It has all the humor. It has the heart. It has just the charm of its leads. It's easily just the iconic feel-good flick of the 80s. And I just love the chemistry between Guttenberg, Danson, and Selleck. They're just cool from the beginning to the end of this movie. And to me, this is a movie that you can just kind of sit down and have a blast with no matter what you're doing. For Touchstone's last movie of the year, they had a release date of Christmas Day, and fresh off his directing of Tin Men, Barry Levinson would return to direct this war-set comedy. Now, at the time, Robin Williams was known. He had his TV resume. He had a couple of notable films such as Club Paradise and The Best of Times, but he was not yet the A-list star that he would become. He had also had some highly publicized issues with drugs and alcohol in the past, which was a worry for the board members at Disney. But as we mentioned earlier, when talking about Michael Eisner's hire on the cheap methods, Williams was a risk worth taking for him.
Boy, do I have a surprise for you.
Good morning, Vietnam!
Good Morning Vietnam would center on an irreverent, loudmouth DJ that's working the U.S. Armed Forces radio station during Vietnam, where his antics would inspire the soldiers and infuriate his superiors. Williams would headline this cast that also consisted of Forrest Whitaker and Bruno Kirby, Robert Wall, and J.T. Walsh. This movie would be a smash hit for an R-rated comedy, and it would be the breakout for Williams that would catapult him to stardom. Good Morning Vietnam would land in the theaters on December 25th in just 4 major markets. This is common for movies that are planned for a wider release the following year, but still want to be eligible for awards contention that current year. Good Morning Vietnam would play in just 4 major cities for 3 weeks, then would open wide across the country on January 15th of 1988, and during its opening wide release, Good Morning Vietnam would command the #1 spot with a $12 million weekend, finally knocking 3 Men and a Baby down to the #2 spot. This film also had incredible legs. It would spend 9 straight weeks in the #1 spot, 14 weeks in the top 10. Audiences ate this movie's poignant, heartfelt story up, and it would go on to earn $124 million on a $13 million budget. Williams was praised for his performance. He would get an Oscar nomination for Best Actor. He wouldn't win it, but he would take home the Golden Globe in that same category. And again, this is one of those movies I've watched so many times over the years, and I just couldn't love Williams' performance more. So there's no doubt Touchstone Pictures had a fantastic 1987 at the theater, with 4 movies ending up in the top 20 at the domestic box office, with 3 Men and a Baby taking the top spot. It just seemed all was going as planned. The assembly line of movie making was effective. Things would continue into 1988, where Touchstone Pictures would drop 10 movies during the calendar year, all of which will be covered in the next volume of this series. Now, much like they did in 87, Touchstone Pictures would have a solid 1988. They kicked the year off with Good Morning Vietnam going wide and just pulling in a ton of cash from all the hype that it had built up from the 87 award season. Touchstone Pictures would have some big splashy commercial hits in 88, as well as a few quiet successes and a few failures as well, but their filmmaking formula that I covered in the prior videos was still proving to be a winning recipe for box office gains. Now, for Touchstone's first new release of 1988, we need to step back into April of 85, where Columbia Pictures had been working on a wilderness set action thriller with the working title of In the Hall of the Mountain King. By the time March 86 rolled around, development had halted and Columbia labeled the project as inactive. Fast forward a year into March of 87, The Hollywood Reporter listed the film as having a new title, Mountain King. Touchstone Pictures liked this project. They made a deal. It got done. The movie would go into production with principal photography beginning in April of 1987. Shoot to Kill, known in many countries as Deadly Pursuit, would center on an FBI agent who teams up with an experienced trapper to hunt a killer who has disappeared out into the wilderness after jumping in with a group of hikers. This would be the first performance from screen legend Sidney Poitier in 11 years, and alongside him would be 80s and 90s staple Tom Berenger, with Kirstie Alley, Richard Masur, and Clancy Brown filling out the strong supporting cast. This action thriller would hit theaters on February 12th to take the number 2 spot behind Good Morning Vietnam, which was just still cruising right along in the number 1 spot on its 8th weekend. Shoot to Kill would earn mostly positive reviews, with critics praising the performances and the direction, while those on the negative side sort of dinging the film because of its formulaic plot. However, just loved this movie. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. This movie felt like it was kind of set in my backyard. I loved the action. I loved the suspense that it delivered. And as I get older, I greatly appreciate the on-location shoots and just the pure natural chemistry that you get between Poitier and Berenger. Audiences enjoyed this movie as well. Shoot to Kill would spend 3 weeks in the number 2 spot and pull in a respectable $29.3 million on a $15 million budget. And I think this movie still holds up great all these years later because it just delivers non-stop thrilling suspense and plenty of high energy action.
You almost got me shot. Most girls wait a lifetime for a date like this.
Just a month later, Touchstone's next movie would drop into theaters with the mystery thriller DOA, a remake of the 1950 film that had been adapted a few times over the years before this one. This version starred Dennis Quaid, Meg Ryan, and Daniel Stern, and for those of you who don't know, it centers on a professor who is poisoned and has 36 hours to find out who did it, which is not going to come easy as his health begins to fail. So this was certainly one of those few attempts Touchstone would make in the niche film genre. DOA would be released on March 18th and received mixed to positive reviews. I'd never watched this one entirely through until making this video, and overall it's decent. I like some of the experimentation with film techniques, and some of the manipulation of the lighting is cool. The color kind of slowly washes away from this movie as the story gets deeper into the plot, and it's okay. It feels a little bit gimmicky, I would say, with everything else going on in this one, but overall, I enjoyed this movie. Even if I have no desire to watch it again, DOA would land in the number 3 spot with a $3.8 million weekend, and during its short 3-week run in theaters, it would pull in $12.7 million on a $3.5 million budget. So while not blowing the doors off the bank, DOA did finish in the green, which is a success for a niche film that was never going to have a ton of commercial appeal anyway. So only 3 months into 88, and Touchstone Pictures was more than already holding its own as a box office heavyweight. When DOA would be released, Touchstone Pictures would have 3 movies in the top 10, with Good Morning Vietnam, DOA of course, and 3 Men and a Baby still earning. It seemed even if Touchstone delivered a film that critics were unfavorable of, the movie would still turn a profit. Now, some of this could be chalked up to just the common disconnect between film critics and general movie-going audiences, but more so it was just a show of just the result of the booming business of cinema. During the 80s, multiplexes were popping up all over the country. With every shopping mall came a theater. With every new suburb further from the metropolitan hub, a new movie theater was going in as well. And during this time, just going to the movies actually meant something. People would go to see whatever was out, and the power of word of mouth would either make or break a movie more than what critics ever had to say. This is how commercial films could last in theaters for months, particularly during the summer season, and much like they did in the summer of 1987, Touchstone had a lot planned in 88, and their first of the season was a comedy that they hoped would be a big commercial hit.
Are we gonna let them swoop down on us like a bunch of turkey buzzards in business suits? We're going to New York City! We're going to New York City!
Bette Midler would knock another film off of her Touchstone contract when she starred alongside Lily Tomlin in the high charisma comedy Big Business, a film about 2 sets of identical twins, one set out in the country, the other set out in the big city, who through a comedy of errors will learn that they all have a much deeper connection to one another. Big Business would land in theaters on June 10th, taking the number 3 spot with a $6.1 million weekend, and it did come out during some strong summer competition with movies such as Crocodile Dundee 2 and big and Rambo 3, but it would hold its own. This was clearly alternative viewing for the summer audiences not interested in big action or horror. I remember my aunt and grandma watching this one and just getting a kick out of it. I actually watched it for the first time to make this video, and I thought it was funny. It runs a little bit long, but the performances from Midler and Tomlin are highly amusing. However, to me, the silly humor did start to feel a little bit repetitive. There was enough audience appeal, however, to make this movie a success. Big Business would earn a strong $40.2 million. The budget of $20 million was a tad high for this comedy, but necessary for the 5 months of post-production needed to create all the visual effects. Sadly, though, $40 million was probably not the $50 to $60 million that Touchstone was hoping to get from this movie, given the past 2 summers of success that Midler had brought them. Regardless, though, whatever disappointment that Touchstone may have been feeling about the lack of box office pop from Big Business would disappear just a few weeks later when Touchstone would partner with Amblin Entertainment to deliver a film that would just capture the world's imagination and just rake in an avalanche of cash. Stepping back in time to 1981, Disney had purchased the film rights to a little book called Who Censored Roger Rabbit by Gary Wolfe. Disney had a couple of scripts written, and then they would bring in Steven Spielberg and his Amblin Entertainment, and the result would be an iconic film and the second highest grossing film of 1988.
Well, I'm sorry I yanked your ears.
All the time you yanked my ear?
Now, Who Framed Roger Rabbit was a movie that would hit the trifecta. It was a success with critics, it was adored by audiences, and it was a winner-come-award season set in an alternate golden era of Hollywood where humans and toons coexist. A hapless toon named Roger Rabbit is framed for a crime, and it will be up to a grumpy old detective played by Bob Hoskins to prove his innocence to the villainous Judge Doom, played by Christopher Lloyd. Who Framed Roger Rabbit would splash into theaters right in June, right in the middle of the summer, to just wrangle in audiences to the theater. I remember seeing this movie in the cinema a handful of times, and it was just the 4-quadrant commercial hit that Touchstone needed. It would open with $11.2 million to take the #1 spot. It would be a top 3 movie for 7 weeks, a top 10 movie for a staggering 17 weeks, and it's easy to see why. I mean, what this movie delivered, people had never seen before, with such seamless blending between human actors and cartoon characters, and audiences loved it. Roger Rabbit was just a fixture of my childhood, and it still holds up impressively all these years later. The budget was reported to be $70 million. The production companies insisted it was only $50 million. Regardless, it would pull in $351.5 million worldwide, and it undoubtedly killed it on the home video market. The story is engaging, the humor lands, the nostalgia is just cemented in place, and it's rightfully an iconic movie in cinematic history. Now, behind the scenes at this time, Disney was already working on another source of funding. The money from the Silver Screen Partners 3 deal was beginning to run dry, so in June of 1988, Disney would strike one final deal with SSP. Silver Screen Partners 4 would be set in place, and from an estimated 52,000 investors, the partnership would raise $400 million for future films, and Touchstone and Disney would use these films not exclusively to finance movies for the next 3 years. Over on the public side, with Roger Rabbit still earning at the box office, Touchstone would drop their last big splashy hit of the summer. They had acquired a script from Universal Pictures about this college student who moonlights as a bartender, and the result, as gloriously 80s as it was, would end up being the 8th highest grossing film of the year.
Get the women, you get the bucks. And you can see the color of their panties, and you know you've got talent. Stick with me, son, I'll make you a star.
Now, Tom Cruise would have a fantastic 1988. He starred alongside Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man, a deeply emotional, layered drama that would go on to be the highest grossing movie of the year. Cruise would also tend bar in an emotionally transparent romantic drama called Cocktail alongside Brian Brown and Elizabeth Shue. Cocktail would hit theaters at the end of July, and with its vanity, its style, and its sex appeal, it would open #1 with a big $11.8 million weekend, and really it would dominate the rest of the summer. Cocktail would spend 2 weeks in the #1 spot, another 12 weeks in the top 10, Critics, of course, disliked this vanity film that was just fueled on all the superficiality that the 80s had to offer, but audiences loved it. I caught pieces of this movie when I was a kid, but I really discovered it in the early 90s on cable as a teenager. I always had a huge crush on Shu, so I was just all in on this flashy coming-of-age tale of romance and mixing drinks and self-discovery. And to be honest, I still love this movie today. When I was a teen, I wanted to open my own bar. I attended bar in college because of this movie. I've drank in more than my share of red eyes, and I still quote this movie whenever possible. And with its budget of $20 million, it would go on to earn $171.5 million. And despite its flaws, you just can't deny this film's lovable charm. So once again, like they did in 87, you could say that Touchstone killed it in the summer of 88 with the success of Roger Rabbit and Cocktail. These two movies alone equated to more than $520 million of the summer box office, and you could be certain that the execs with Touchstone were riding high. But as you know, business in Hollywood is volatile, and Touchstone would follow up their summer success with 3 commercial failures in a row over the next few months.
Maybe they've written my father off, but I haven't.
You mean we go get them?
Why not?
I love it.
In August, they would release The Rescue, one of many teen adventure movies from the 80s. Many of these films have gone on to hold cult status, but financially at the time, they were either hit or miss, and The Rescue would be a miss. Movies like Red Dawn were able to find that balance, but the concept of the kids of Navy SEALs venturing into South Korea to rescue their fathers was a bit too much of a stretch for most people. The film had a budget of $14.5 million, and it would only earn back $5.8 million. But as I said, silly movies like these have aged better over time through a nostalgic lens, and despite its notable flaws, there is a charm to be found in this fantasy-level teen action adventure. Touchstone's next movie would land in September. It would be their first financed under the new Silver Screen Partners 4 deal, and it would not kick the loan off on a good foot. Heartbreak Hotel, written and directed by Chris Columbus, would follow a group of teenage friends who want to set up a band at high school, so they kidnap Elvis. This movie received mixed to negative reviews, and audiences were not really interested either, as it would only earned back $5.5 million of its $13 million budget. And you know, this movie never really grabbed me back in the day. I remember seeing it on cable, but it was just never a film that was in my rotation growing up.
Where's Molly?
She's not coming back to you.
What are you talking about?
Ask your boyfriend. Why don't you just ask your boyfriend why I'm taking Molly?
Then in November, Touchstone would release their annual awards attempt with a niche drama starring Diane Keaton and Liam Neeson called The Good Mother, directed by Leonard Nimoy. I had never heard of this movie before making this video, but the plot sounds a bit Oscar baity, involving the daughter of a woman getting involved in a questionable situation with the mother's boyfriend. It really does sound like an attempt at conjuring up moral and ethical drama, but it was clearly a swing and a miss, pulling in just $4.8 million of its $14 million budget. Word of mouth was presumably not good on this movie either, and with it being the third film in a row to lose money, I'm sure Touchstone was beginning to worry just a little.
I knew it. What? It's a staff meeting. So what? So what? We're all screwed, that's what.
Heading into the Christmas corridor, and Touchstone Pictures was stumbling from 3 consecutive theatrical failures. They needed a hero, potentially a hero the studio had found success with the prior summer. Touchstone needed a hero that could save the day financially, and while he was at it, maybe save Christmas along the way, and that hero they would find.
Santa's in the slammer.
Look at those beady, twinkling...
Ernest Saves Christmas would bring back the fun-loving Ernest, who has traded his dreams of being a summer camp counselor to drive a taxi. And one day, Ernest is going about his business and finds that one of his riders is the real Santa Claus. And the next thing you know, Ernest is finding himself on a mission to help Santa find his successor and to save the holiday. Ernest Saves Christmas would open on November 11th and take the number 2 spot behind Child's Play with a solid $5.7 million weekend. Timing was naturally great for this little comedic adventure. Holiday films tend to do well, and Ernest was a known fixture in pop culture at this time, so Ernest Saves Christmas did great. I loved this movie as a kid. I watched it every year growing up, and even today, watching Ernest, Santa, and their random crew of friends just save the holiday is kind of a charming throwback to that kid inside of me who sat in front of the TV with a PB&J watching this movie and thinking about what I had under the tree. Ernest Saves Christmas would spend 6 weeks in the top 10 and earn a respectable $28.2 million on just a $6.5 million budget. And while it didn't blow the doors off the bank again, I'm sure Touchstone was finally happy to have a movie back in the green.
Caught Michael with another woman? Yeah. And now you're going to have a baby all on your own? Having a baby without a father, am I being selfish? All great love is selfish.
But they weren't done. Touchstone had one last movie to deliver in 1988, and it would come on Christmas with the musical dramedy Beaches, starring Bette Midler and Barbara Hershey, directed by Gary Marshall. This movie would be a hit amongst the older crowd at the time. The market for poignant dramas with undercurrents of reflective humor were popular, and Beaches just checked all the sentimental boxes. Beaches would drop into theaters on December 21st, and it was well received. Critics were a bit lukewarm on it, but audiences, on the other hand, just loved the sentimentality of the friendships and just the emotions explored in this movie. Midler's version of Wind Beneath My Wings became a #1 song and was probably more popular than this movie was at the time. That song was everywhere. I had never actually watched this movie. My family did have the other aunts and uncles over to watch it one evening. I can remember that as a kid because it was a rare thing. So when the family did that, it had to be a very popular film amongst the olds at the time. They really only did that with like Cocoon and Not Without My Daughter and a few other movies. I actually watched this movie for this video, and it's fine, I guess. It's not really my cup of tea, but I will admit that it's well written, acted, and directed. It would pull in $57 million on a $20 million budget. The soundtrack to this movie probably made a killing as well, and like the Titanic in the 90s, it seems every house had a copy of Beaches on VHS stuffed in their oversized entertainment center. So to close out 1988, Disney Pictures, with the assistance of the Touchstone banner, had officially beaten out the other studios to sit atop the mountain of the box office receipts. With Roger Rabbit, Good Morning Vietnam, 3 Men and a Baby, and Cocktail, Disney had 4 films in the top 10 at the domestic box office that year. At this same time, several movie production studios were starting to move away from feature films and closing their doors, so Disney would use the opportunity to create another production label to fill the void. Michael Eisner's initial pitch of Hollywood Pictures from years earlier had been incorporated, and in December it would be announced for a launch of February of 1989, with Touchstone Pictures officially up and running and essentially a twin version of it in Hollywood Pictures getting up and running. Disney at this time was only growing their domination of the film market, and in the next video we'll be diving into their run of films during 1988, where Touchstone would release 8 more films. I'll make sure to leave links to my other videos in this series covering the creation, growth, and success of Touchstone Pictures between 1984 and 1988 for you guys to check out if you did miss them. But to summarize, in the early 80s, a slumping Disney found a business model it could use to mature as a studio without alienating its core family audience. They created the banner of Touchstone Pictures, and after that, Disney would go on to then confidently push the boundaries with PG-13 and R-rated content while still shielding the main brand. This really did allow them to maintain their family-friendly core while also expanding into adult markets. And this proved to be a very successful compartmentalization tactic. They also implemented strong genre diversification balancing between quirky teen, adult, and romantic comedies with sentimental dramas, splashes of action, and the occasional thriller, which did give Disney a much broader audience reach. And between 1986 and 1988, they commanded the box office, which was obviously something the top brass wanted to see continue moving into 1989. With the strong box office results coming in, Disney quickly realized that adult-themed content could generate reliable returns. They could also be made quickly and for much less money, which studio exec loved, especially when animated films had a much longer and more expensive production timeline. So Disney, through Touchstone Pictures, would lean heavily into their new filmmaking strategy. That strategy in a nutshell: to work off smaller budgets and to establish and strengthen relationships with major stars on the rise or just past their rise, or still maybe reeling from some bad press or legal issues who could still draw adult audiences. This is something that really did pay off for actors such as Bette Midler, Danny DeVito, Richard Dreyfuss, Tom Hanks, Nick Nolte, Robin Williams, and many others who all fell into one of these categories, and they all ended up having multiple successes under Touchstone. Executives would also use Touchstone Pictures to kind of build actor goodwill, then try to leverage those relationships across other Disney labels for future projects, with the more notable examples of this being Robin Williams voicing the genie in Aladdin, a landmark Disney Renaissance film, or maybe Tom Hanks being a central Disney Pixar figure in the Toy Story franchise as Woody. Now, the funding for their films came through limited partnership deals. Silver Screen Partners 2 was their first financing partnership, consisting of an estimated 20,000 investors. This partnership would really allow Disney to allocate plenty of money to the Touchstone banner for production, and the returns were fantastic. By the time 1989 came around, Disney's film production was almost entirely funded by Silver Screen Partners 4, which at about $300 million was more than enough to float the bill for both Disney and Touchstone projects, working well into 1991. As a studio, Touchstone was rolling by 1987. Between 87 and 88, they'd released 19 movies, most of which were all successes. However, at the same time, this was also an interesting little period in Hollywood. Many smaller studios financially were in a state of flux. Embassy Pictures had closed their doors in 1986. The De Laurentiis Group and Lorimar were having business-altering money issues, as well as were Canon and Carolco. No surprise there. So Disney would see an opportunity during this contraction in the industry to actually strengthen their foothold and release even more movies to once again diversify their revenue. Disney would greenlight Hollywood Pictures in February of '89, and the plan was to share funds from the Silver Screen Partners 4 deal to kick off their slate of movies planned for a launch of the summer of 1990, starting with Arachnophobia. Now, we'll get all into Hollywood Pictures and their history in a future series, but as for Touchstone Pictures, this would be a time of transition. Suddenly, the movie-making money had to be split three ways. Touchstone wouldn't have the luxury of bumping up a budget here or there to get something through or to get a specific actor, so the pressure was on for their slate of movies in 1989 to deliver that same box office punch executives were accustomed to, but they had much less margin for error this year. Now, for Touchstone's first movie of 1989, we need to go back in time to the Cannes Film Festival in 1985. This is when Touchstone's Jeffrey Katzenberg would solicit a screenplay from French director Francis Weber. Weber had a script already planned for production in France called Les Fugitifs. At the time of the festival, production hadn't even started on that French version yet, but Katzenberg greenlit a US remake, and Weber would get to work on an English version of the script.
See this? It's a grenade! And I'm pulling the pin, so no funny business!
Released in January and directed by Weber, Touchstone's first release of the year would be Three Fugitives, starring Nick Nolte as a grizzled ex-con and Martin Short as a hopelessly nervous first-time bank robber who, along with a little girl in tow, stumble into a chaotic partnership in what would turn out to be a charming little offbeat crime comedy. Critics, on the other hand, were pretty harsh on this movie, and while I wouldn't consider it groundbreaking by any means, I do think it delivers a fun, charismatic adventure of comedic errors. It would open in the number 2 spot, but then jump up to the number 1 spot on its second weekend, and it would hold in the top 5 for 5 weeks. So it had a decent audience. Nolte has his humorously lumbering moments, despite probably being miscast here. Short, though, is the shining light in this little gem, and he does effectively carry the comedic weight. It gets a little silly at times, but it's still a feel-good just film that audiences would enjoy. Three Fugitives would pull in $40.6 million on a $15 million budget, and it would end up being a crowd-pleasing comedy that was much better than the traditional options found at the cinemas in January.
What are you doing?
I'm speaking with a dead friend of mine.
Well, would you rather talk privately? Because I could wait in the other room.
No, that's not necessary.
Touchstone would get artsy with its next release in March with New York Stories, an anthology film directed by Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, and Woody Allen, with each of them presenting a uniquely personal short film set in the heart of New York City, with stars like Nick Nolte, Rosanna Arquette, and Mia Farrow headlining the different casts. Now, in all honesty, I've never seen this film entirely through. I do remember seeing Scorsese short back in a film class, but I haven't seen Coppola or Allen's. I thought Scorsese's short film about a painter who gets a creative block on the eve of a gallery show was fine. Nothing that really grabbed me, though, and I apparently wasn't the only one. This experiment from Touchstone would be a critical and financial flounder. The small audience this type of film would actually attract were actually lukewarm on this one, as were critics. New York Stories' wide release was a letdown, only taking the number 8 spot with a $2.4 million weekend, and it wouldn't get much better by managing to limp out just $10.8 million on a $15 million budget. This was sort of a theme with Touchstone at the time, kind of slipping these art house passion projects into their schedules, and this time around it was a misfire. Now, behind the scenes at this time, Touchstone was still working to diversify their earnings on the home entertainment side. An exclusive rights deal had already been in place with Showtime since back in 1987. At the time of that contract signing, Showtime was the second largest pay television service behind HBO, and a new deal was struck with Disney, which gave Showtime exclusivity on all films through 1996 for both Touchstone and upcoming Hollywood Pictures films. The prior deal in place had been for 50 movies, and industry insiders believed this new deal was worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $500 million. Now, on the cable TV side, Disney had struck a deal with the USA Network for cable television rights to 26 movies from the Touchstone banner, in a deal that experts predicted was somewhere in the neighborhood of the $50 million range. So despite being a little slow out of the gate in theaters to kick off 1989, they were still making some very profitable business moves.
Where's Frank?
Where the hell is Frank?
Maybe he found a woman.
Maybe he got lost.
Trying to rebound in April, Touchstone would release Disorganized Crime, a small heist comedy directed by Jim Koof, where a gang of mismatched criminals played by Corbin Burnson, Lou Diamond Phillips, Fred Gwynn, and Ruben Blades attempt a small-town bank job that naturally spirals hilariously out of control. Now, I still enjoy this movie. I do think it's much better than it was received at the time. I think the main problem for this movie was that it just came out a week after The Dream Team. Different stories, but still a movie that had that same concept. A group of eccentric adults bumbling through a plot together. I do think the cast here, though, is fantastic. They're great together. I think the laughs are frequent, but it never took off. It would open in the 6th spot with just a $2.8 million weekend. Now, sure, I won't say this movie is laugh out loud hilarious, but I do think it does have more than its fair share of comical situations and fun slapstick banter between the group, particularly from Phillips and Blades. Sadly, though, audiences just didn't fill the theaters for this movie, and it would only get a 2-week run to pull in just a meager $5.3 million on a $7.7 million budget, but I have no doubt this one did pretty well on home video. So at this point in the year, Touchstone was entering spring without a sizable hit to be proud of. Three Fugitives was a success, but nothing that would be cause for a Brinks truck having to deliver the profits to the bank. The studio needed a hit. They needed a film that would pop like they had in years past with Roger Rabbit in '88, or movies like 3 Men and a Baby or Good Morning Vietnam in 87 or even Ruthless People in 1986, and they felt they had that film on their hands. This movie, however, would not come without its production hurdles. Many heavyweight actors were in talks to play the leading role in this film, such as Gibson, Rourke, Hanks, Hoffman. Touchstone Pictures and Disney, they wanted Robin Williams, and they would get Robin Williams. The only problem is Robin Williams did not want to work with original director Jeff Canoe. He refused to work with him. He did a no-show on day one of production, so Touchstone would have to quickly pivot. They brought in Peter Weir to direct, and just like that, the studio's crown jewel of a movie in 1989 was back on schedule.
Language was developed for one endeavor, and that is
To communicate.
no, to woo women.
Premiering in June, Dead Poets Society featured Robin Williams in one of his most iconic roles as an inspiring teacher at a rigid prep school, awakening a love of poetry, rebellion, and self-expression in all of his students. Despite all the issues, getting Williams into this character was certainly worth it, as there is no denying he is the driving force. This movie is well acted, well written, strongly directed, it has a great score and great cinematography, but Williams is that emotional spark plug that just gets this movie going. He's perfect as this unorthodox English teacher who encourages his students to seize the day and to embrace poetry and life and nonconformity. This movie would become a touchstone for the teen drama done with grace and gravitas. It's also that rare case where sentiment and sincerity win without tipping into melodrama, and audiences were all in on this movie. It would get a rollout release, first just on 8 screens, then under 700 screens its second weekend before going wide, but nothing would stop this movie when word of mouth would spread. It would spend 9 weeks in the top 10 and go on to rake in more than $235 million globally on just a $16.4 million budget. It would get 3 Oscar nominations for Best Picture, Director, and Actor, and it would take home a trophy for the screenplay, further cementing the film as just an indelible piece of cinematic history. There's no denying Touchstone was riding high off the success of Dead Poets Society and its wide commercial appeal, but they weren't done with their summer slate of movies. They had one more project up their sleeve, this one a much lighter film in tone, but also another that was saddled with its own production problems. This was actually a script Touchstone had high hopes for. They paid $1 million for it, which at the time was the highest amount they'd ever spent for one. They also had the Fonz Henry Winkler on as the director, with Tom Hanks fresh off the momentum of Big in the lead, but just a couple weeks into production, Hanks and Winkler had a falling out. Production was halted, but Touchstone needed to hit their summer release date, so a new director would be brought in once again to keep things on schedule.
No slobbering, no chewing. You will wear a fleet collar.
Released in late July, Turner and Hooch is a canine buddy comedy directed by Roger Spottiswoode, where Tom Hanks plays a tidy detective forced to team up with a slobbering dog to solve a murder, whether he likes it or not, in a movie that Stanley Kubrick once stated was one of his favorites. Now, this movie would land in theaters about 3 months after K-9, Jim Belushi's similarly themed action comedy about a cop who teams up with an ill-disciplined dog in order to solve crimes. It follows all the tropes, and it hinges entirely on the comedic tension between man and mutt, yet it works. I think Hanks's manic, exasperated energy just bounces hilariously off of Hooch's slobbery chaos, and beneath all the silliness is a surprisingly effective murder mystery and a touching story of companionships. Hanks here would also solidify his growing versatility as a leading man in the late 80s. It's silly, it's sentimental, and occasionally suspenseful, just a weird cocktail that still manages to sit well, and audiences would be drawn into this film's charm. It would open in the #1 spot with a $12.2 million weekend, and it would never drop out of the top 10 during its 11-week run to earn a respectable $71.1 million on just a $13 million budget. Touchstone had intended to ride on the buddy dog comedy movie wave that was growing in Hollywood at the time, and this time it was a financial success.
You have been found guilty.
You know I'm innocent. You know it.
No, I want to be with them.
Kate, I love you.
October '89 would be the release of An Innocent Man, a tense drama directed by Peter Yates and starring Tom Selleck as a man wrongfully imprisoned who fights to survive behind bars and expose the corrupt cops who put him there. I think An Innocent Man is one of those underrated flicks where Tom Selleck gets to take a rare break from his mustachioed Hawaiian shirted persona. Here he's just a normal working class guy wrongfully imprisoned after corrupt cops plant drugs in his house, and what follows is a gritty blue-collar crime prison drama with shades of a revenge thriller complemented by a hard moral center. I think Selleck's great here. He provides a surprisingly commanding performance, transitioning from the victim to vengeful survivor with a convincing grit. The movie is a bit on the nose, but Yates brings solid direction, turning what really would be a straightforward premise into very highly emotionally engaging ride, to be honest with you. It would open in the number 3 spot with a $5.7 million weekend and go on to earn a respectable $20 million to turn itself into a modest hit. It's certainly more grounded than flashy, but I think it's all the more effective for it. It's definitely not talked about much today, but it's a compelling and tightly made crime drama that's certainly worth rediscovering if you haven't seen it or if you haven't seen it in some time.
A question that any student in the 8th month of anatomy class should be able to answer.
Touchstone would drop another movie later in October with Gross Anatomy, directed by Tom Eberhardt, following Matthew Modine as a young, carefree first-year med student who learns that getting through school and life is going to take a lot more than his boyish charm, especially alongside co-stars like Daphne Zuniga and Christine Laddie. This film just serves up a light blend of medical drama and coming-of-age comedy as Matthew Modine, a brash, first-year med student, tries to juggle life, anatomy lab, and a whole lot of cadaver talk. It's kind of like Dead Poets Society meets Scrubs, but with more formaldehyde. The film definitely captures that reluctant genius tropes and tries to capitalize on it. And while it's not reinventing the stethoscope by any means, it does offer an earnest look at the emotional and physical toll that medical school can take. I think Modine's fine. He brings a likable charisma. Daphne Zuniga, she's good as well. She holds her own as his driven lab partner. Gross Anatomy is just one of those movies that kind of captures late 80s studio filmmaking where heartwarming and clinical somehow work together. It's not high drama, but it does go down easy. Audiences, though, were lukewarm on this one. Sadly, it would open in the number 5 spot with just a $2.8 million weekend, and when all was said and done, earnings would top out at just $11.6 million on an $8.5 million budget, which is, I'm sure, had more than a few executives kind of pondering their own trips to urgent care.
God, them's a big pair of rascals you got.
Are you talking about my eyes, Governor?
And rounding out the year in December of 1989 would be Blaze, directed by Ron Shelton, starring Paul Newman as Louisiana Governor Earl Long, and a steamy, political-tinged romance with Lolita Davidovich as the provocative burlesque dancer who challenges both his heart and his public image. To me, Blaze is one of those movies that kind of struts into the room with its nice suit, a cigar, a wink, and a scandal under its arm. This sultry political biopic tells the mostly true story of a Louisiana governor played with roguish charm by Paul Newman, who falls head over heels in love for Blaze Starr, a fiery burlesque dancer played by Lolita Davidovich in her breakout role. Now, the film walks a tightrope between Southern fried drama and romantic comedy, never quite sure if it wants to seduce the audience or filibuster them, which did result in a lukewarm opening. Blaze would take the number 9 spot with a $1.7 million weekend, and it would only manage to pull in $19 million on a $22 million budget. Critics were a bit off on this one. Audiences didn't really know what to do with it. So despite the genuine chemistry between Newman and Davidovich, Blaze would not turn into that end of the year awards bait contender that Touchstone execs were expecting. But regardless, I think Blaze stands out as a late career curveball for Newman, equal parts striptease, satire, and Southern charm, all wrapped in a haze of tobacco smoke and political sass. So closing out the year and ending the 80s, Touchstone Pictures had successfully cemented itself as a bona fide heavyweight player in Hollywood. This little studio certainly had big studio backing, but all the creativity in these films released by Touchstone Pictures during the 80s would just change the landscape of the mid-level film that could just thrive on great performances and creative ideas for cinematic storytelling. They found a formula for success, and they would only lean more into it as the decade would turn, because Touchstone would only continue their box office domination in the 90s, releasing over 100 films that for the most part are still remembered to this day. I hope you guys have all enjoyed this look back at the rise of Touchstone Pictures during the 80s. We'll continue this journey into the 90s in a future series, but that's it for Touchstone for now. What are some of your favorite movies from Touchstone Pictures during the 80s? Let me know down in the comments. Thank you guys, as always, so much for watching my videos and this series. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope to see you guys at the next one coming real soon. And until then, movies never say die.
This is Jack Burton in the Pork Chop Express, and I'm talking to whoever's listening out there.
Flag of war. You gotta become war.
I suppose we have to register you as a lethal weapon.
You trying to say Jesus Christ can't hit a curveball?